y a los cuatro vientos quiero gritarle te quiero y lo reconozco que vivir sin ti no puedo. Me abrazo a mi almohada a ver si me da consejo. Dice que lo olvide y olvidarlo yo no puedo. Y a los cuatro vientos quiero gritarle te quiero y lo reconozco que vivir sin ti no puedo. Me abrazo a mi almohada a ver si me da consejo. Dice que lo olvide y olvidarlo yo no puedo. Y ahora que ya estoy harta de decirte.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of Tea Talk with Ro. I am your host, Ro, giving you the latest on everything media. You were just listening to A los Four Vientos by Paula Diaz. Now, let's get started with today's episode, shall we? Today is a very special episode, and I just want to say that this episode excites me because we are finally going to be talking about powers, aka Nen for once. It has been a while since we have discussed that, so I just want to give a forewarning heads up that that's exactly what we're discussing. And let's just dive into the fun today. So, what I'm going to introduce you guys today is we're discussing Hisoka's mother, and we are on the topic of education, and we're talking about Hisoka's mother's Nen powers and spiritual practices and what she particularly has taught Hisoka, or an impact education wise on Hisoka from the perspective of powers. I thought that this was a pretty interesting thing to explore, and I just want us to dive into this topic so we can think about it a bit more, especially considering that we are now entering into the education section of the analysis, or early education, as I should say. But let's get right into it, everybody. So, we're going to break this down into three parts. We're going to have a part one, part two, part three. If you ever need time to have breaks in the in between, that is completely okay because there will be intermissions as it is. So, let's get into part one. Hello, everybody, and welcome to part one, where we will be discussing Hispanic Romani religions practices. See how we come back full circle? Because earlier in these whole entire podcast series, we were talking about like origins and, like racial origins and essentially the theory of where I think racially, ethnically, Hisoka came from. Nationally, he counts as our version of American. That I know for a fact. He came from the USS, which is their version of the USA. And ethnically speaking, this is essentially what I said. On his dad's side, I thought he is of, and theorized, inferenced, what have you, that he is of a mixture of European, French most likely, and East Asian of some kind. I debated whether it was Japanese or Korean. That's essentially what I said for his dad's side. On his mom's side, and he is more so influenced by her culture because he was raised primarily by his mother. Dad was not in the picture at all, so even if I'm right on that, it would not have mattered considering that he did not raise him at all. It was just his mom. It was just me and her, it's just mama and him just living out, doing their thing. And I said that his mother is of Hispanic Romani origin. And I want to talk about how that impacts his learning when it comes to Nen, especially in his ages 0 to 10. So young child, infancy kind of stage. But first, part one is basically introducing what those beliefs even are before we talk about how it impacted him as a whole. The roots of Roma beliefs. Let's get down into it. So let's start off with Romani religious beliefs are rooted in Hinduism. The reason why they're rooted in Hinduism is essentially because the Romani people are ancestrally from India. And again, I talked about this earlier. What happened is due to a lot of historical disasters that mostly had to deal with invasions and all this different stuff that basically impacts your land. It got invaded, it got taken over, wars erupted, this, that, and the fourth. All kinds of things were happening during the time in which a certain group of Indians, so a certain section of India, basically had to regroup outside of India due to political upheaval. So they migrated to different sections of the world. They were all over the world. And some have migrated to what we now know as like Latin American regions or Hispanic regions, aka regions that now primarily speak Spanish. Hispanic Romani people, they originated way back in the day in India, but eventually they had to basically adjust to whatever culture that they ended up in because they went from one place to the next due to mostly political upheaval. And they, for the Hispanic Romani population that are also known as Calo, or the term is Gintana or Gintano. I don't want to say it completely, even though I just said it only to have an example. In case you hear it, it's like you know what type. It's also Calo. There's different names for it, but I don't want to say their version of the G slur because I'm not sure if it's appropriate for me to say. So from this point on, I will only be referring to it as either Hispanic Romani or Calo only. But essentially, that group of Romani people, they moved into Hispanic regions, such as Spain is technically a Hispanic region, it's just not a Latin region. There is a difference. A Latin pertaining to Latin America. You have Latin American regions, which I think is more so his mom's end. I have predicted that the Pacific kind of Hispanic Romani is that of Mexican Romani, which, yes, that is a thing, and I have done research on that. They are a fairly small population, but they do exist in Mexico too. So there's that. There's also a lot of them in Argentina. They're all over Latin America. They're just not big in population, but they do exist. And for at least a lot of the Latin slash Hispanic regions, unlike their Eastern European slash other portions of the world, I would say that their treatment is better. Like it's not as bad as, other parts of the world like Eastern Europe where they get discriminated over there pretty heavily. And for the most part, for a lot of the Hispanic and Latin regions, they just tend to adjust a lot quicker and a lot easier to the point that they kind of blend in with everybody else. Now, I'm not sure as the reason why, but I kind of have a feeling I know what the reason is. And I think it mostly pertains to racism, especially in European regions. Like, I won't get too much into it, but let's just say, for example, when it came to, I think the war is still persisting in like Ukraine, and don't get me wrong, I think what's going on over there is terrible, but to say that they don't have issues would be a lie. And there are issues particularly when it comes to colored people as a whole, but it was highlighted that how they treated their African population during the time was inappropriate at best and disgusting at worst. It just seemed like they just didn't have their priorities straight. Like, wow, guys, we're in the middle of a literal disaster right now, and you are basically still discriminating against people. Like, we need to be serious. Yeah, Eastern Europe just, it has its issues. Not gonna harp too much on it. I feel like it's probably best for someone who is from that region to talk about it. And people have. It's not just me, an outsider looking on in, saying this. This is people who came from that culture being like, yeah, I think my country's okay, but I would say like their racism is just as gross. I would say maybe sometimes worse than the US. So yeah, that's a thing. I just want to touch on that. But especially when it comes to Romani people, I don't know what it is. But, it's argued, I'm not sure if this is completely the 100% the truth, but it is argued that if you even refer to Romani people to European people, it's kind of worse than how they treat black people, and that's already pretty bad as is. So it's like it's a little bit worse than that. Like I've seen the treatment, at least, and how they talk about this particular group of people, it's pretty gross. Yeah. So little rant about that is slightly over, but that's just something that I want to touch on. Like, depending on where you are, they could either not care as much. Like, I know for a fact in the US, if you were to talk about Romani people, there will mostly be like amazement and shock because we don't really hear about them as often. And when we do, unless you're dealing with, again, another racist that just doesn't like colored people in general, most of the time it's pretty like a normal reaction, like, wow, I want to learn more about that culture, that sounds actually interesting and fun, stuff like that, like the normal reaction you would get from somebody who's not from here, who's foreign, but is fascinating. You would mostly get curiosity. So there is that whole entire thing. But that rant aside, you have basically Hinduism and it being like 80% of the Indian population, and it being like the history of the whole Indian subcontinent. So, Hinduism origins date back to more than 5,000 years. That's also an important thing to remember. And I would say way more than that. I just don't know by how much. But Hinduism, I'm going to talk about what it's also known as. It's also known as like Sanatana Dharma, which means an immemorial way of right living. So that's something to keep in mind as well. Hinduism also has both monotheistic, which basically means the belief of one god, and polytheistic, the belief of multiple gods, elements. So, depending on what type, because there's different denominations similar to other religions, Hinduism also has different denominations. Depending on what denomination a certain person believes, they could either put their focus on one particular god within Hinduism, or they could put their focus on multiple. It really just depends on the type of Hinduism their practices, because there are different types. So, the Hindu beliefs, codes, conducts, and other social practices emanate and are drawn from a wide collection of philosophical literatures and scriptures, including the Vedas, the Upanishads, the Brahma Sutras, Bhagavad Gita, the epics of Ramana, and the Mahabharata. In other words, it also has religious books very similar to like the Bible from Christianity, or the Quran from Islam, or essentially all kinds of other books for religions. I know when we think of it is we think of the Quran from Islam, Christianity is the Bible, Judaism has their Torah. They have multiple. So there's more than one versus the other religions where there's just one. And I think the only exception to that would happen to be Judaism because they have the Torah, but they also have multiple other kinds of books as well that basically discusses, and I think like Hinduism similar in the sense that they have like a general book that basically talks about more so the folklorish kind of stories and the basic stories that we kind of understand, which the Torah for reference is pretty much the Old Testament for the Bible. So again, the folklorish tales that you're supposed to learn lessons from. And then you have like the laws of the religion is the other types of books. And I think essentially Hinduism is set up a similar way. I'm not going to say the exact same, but similar, in which they have like the folklorish tales that you're supposed to learn lessons from. And then you have essentially the laws of the religion. So Hinduism has numerous schools of thought, and they have no founder, no hierarchy, no structure. So, unlike the other three religions that I've referenced, there is no founder, so to speak. Nobody started it. Well, somebody did start it, obviously. Otherwise, the religion wouldn't exist. But they just don't name who started it. Like, they rather not name a founder. So, there's no Jesus figure or Muhammad, or just there's no figure that basically it's like this is where it all began, this is where the religion all began. They don't have one point of reference essentially, and I think that's on purpose. Pretty much they would rather not focus on that, and they would just rather focus on like the other thoughts and processes that exist within this religion, and they just rather not have a hierarchy, quote unquote. I will say that people are going to say, oh, they don't have a hierarchy, but what about the caste system? I think that is a bit more on the complicated end. And that isn't to say that, Hinduism doesn't have an influence towards the caste system. I think that has more so to do with like Indian society. So that's more of a sociological issue rather than a theistic issue alone. I don't think it's religion alone as to why the caste system exists. It does have an influence on it though. So I do want to say that, highlight in mind that the caste system does exist and it is influenced by Hindu culture, but it does, I would say, have a more so stronger cause from like, how there's Muslim rules or Islamic rules that are more so social rather than it is from the religion itself. Like, you can clearly tell that there is an impact from like the people and the laws of the land rather than the religion itself. I feel like the caste system is one of those situations where it definitely depends on who is interpreting it and who basically uses that religion for whatever type of power that they feel is needed. But that is probably another complex situation that has to be talked about either later, maybe not by me. I'm pretty sure there's other people who have already researched that. But yeah, I would definitely say that's more of a political slash sociological issue, more so than it is theistic. But that's just how I interpret it based off of the research that I've done. Generally, also, if we're going to continue, one is understood to be a Hindu by being born into a Hindu family. So, in the case of essentially where I think like Hisoka's beliefs are, we're going to talk about how essentially Romani people tend to mix beliefs. So I talk about Hindu practices, but it's more like a half and half, and you'll see what I mean. But the general rule is you're Hindu if you're born into a Hindu family and practicing the faith, or by declaration with no formal conversion. So, unlike other religions, there's no form of formal baptisms or anything like that. So you can pretty much just declare and practice. I'm sure there's a ceremony of some kind. It's just not as formal as the other religions. So a Hindu basically views the entire universe as gods and everything in the universe as God. Hindus believe that each person is intrinsically divine and the purpose of life is to seek and reclaim the divinity within us. So that pretty much is the whole situation with that. And I think that applies again to Nen, because Nen is kind of seen the same way. Like, you see energy, you see Nen within everything or every living being. So I think that same implication is probably what makes it quicker to learn, I would say, for this particular group of people. They already see that there's energy within everything, and basically learning how to harvest the energy at your own will and basically using that divinity within us is pretty much a very similar thing to how Nen is pretty much applied, which is probably why when it comes to like Ahsoka's mom, it was easier to learn. That probably also being, if they're naturally gifted, it's genetically inclined within them. So basically, them just manifesting it outwards is way easier for them to do because they pretty much have the practices down packed already, including meditation, which I'll talk about later. But the laws of karma, which also applies, is the law of cause and effect, in which each and every action has a reaction. Yeah, it's kind of back to science class, but instead of it just applying to the matter of physics, we're applying it to everything in life. So for every action, there's a reaction, right? It's not just a rule that you learn in basic physics, it applies to everything in this case. So it generates conditions to be experienced within this lifetime for the next. So, in other words, if you have a good cause, so a good action, it's going to result in a good reaction or eventually a good reincarnation. That's their primary belief of the afterlife, along with some other things. But you'll have good things to you when this life passes you. That's essentially what that means. And to be fair, a lot of religions go off with this basics. It's not just Hinduism. Like each religion has a different version of it or a different aspect to this. Like you do good on this earth so that the afterlife can be a blessing to you afterwards. So, yeah, that's just the general rule of it all. And it's also known as samsara. So that's another way to look at it. So there's two names for it: karma, samsara. So life is looked upon as a continuum, adding on to this. So the sense that the pristine life energy is never destroyed, death accepted as a process of life, and then Hindus believe in reincarnation. Samsara, everything has its balance, the cycle of life. For each death, there is essentially life being born again. And the process is never destroying energy. Energy is never 100% destroyed, which I guess applies to Nen, because when you really think about it, there's post mortem Nen, which is essentially, even if the body is destroyed, the Nen lives on. So again, this pretty much makes the understanding of Nen probably easier for people that already have these beliefs or even have roots within these beliefs. Like, even if it, again, and we'll talk about this in a minute, is shown way different than what ancestrally was practiced before, if the roots are still in there, then they probably do still understand men better than their counterparts. So again, death is accepted as a process of life, but understanding that energy, or in their world, Nen, never destroyed. They already understand that. So it's the cycle of life: life, death, rebirth. So things just keep going over and over and over again. Things continue onward. They understand that, energy just lives on. So there is that happening to the individual, and individual applies to any living being. So, individual soul on a self realization of its own essential divinity, that is the goal, right? So, what your soul is supposed to experience is a journey through everything involving life. Like the process of everything involved in your life, it is a journey to eventually be reborn again and start the process over again and just have the energy continue in this sort of like a cyclical kind of motion. So it's just never dying. Never ever. Continuing on, Romas believe in a universal balance. So going with the continuation of like samsara, there's also the belief of kantari, which is the universal balance. Everything must have its natural place. So this continues into their Hindu origins, Hindu roots. So everything must have its natural place. Again, going back to with the whole balance element. Birds fly, fish swim, things of nature, it's supposed to follow along. If something seems like it's out of the natural tendency of what things are supposed to be, that's kind of weird to them. If things do not follow the natural order, such as hens, which are birds that don't fly, they're considered bad luck and they will not eat it. So let's say, for example, with Hisoka being raised by his mother, mostly within this kind of environment, that of being mostly surrounded by Hispanic Romani people in their certain neighborhood, right? Certain beliefs, such as like hens being bad luck and believing that it is polluted, they probably will not touch chickens like that. Or they will essentially take care of chickens another way. There's just certain animals where it's like they will not rock with. Hens being one of them. I'm pretty sure I read that amphibians were another. Not really rocking with frogs. Anything that's basically considered weird, put it simply. It's a lot more complicated than just weird, but bad luck, polluted is another term that they use. They just pretty much are like, hey, that's weird. We're not really rocking with it. It's kind of similar, and I believe they have their own version of, what is it? Kosher, where essentially there's just certain animals they won't eat. I don't know if hens, aka chickens are one of them. I would probably have to do research, but I know they also have their own version of kosher in which certain animals they do not eat. They don't touch. I just forgot what their version of kosher is called. I just know that they also have it. So again, it's pretty similar to a lot of other religions as well, where there's just certain animals that they are not touching. And continuing on with this, they also believe it is possible to become spiritually polluted. I do want to highlight this. They don't mean like physically polluted, they mean spiritually. Everything goes back to spirituality. So, in a variety of ways, you can become easily spiritually polluted, and thus you must restore this purity through a trial before the Roma Tribunal of Elders. So again, it is kind of similar to certain other religions where there's just certain things that you do for the religious routine, pretty much. So it sounds weirder than what it is. With Christianity, we have baptisms, right? That is our version of cleaning your sins away, kind of thing. So they have their own version of that I would say there's a lot of similarities with Judaism. So I think the tendency is common, not the exact same, but like common with the practices of that as well, where there's just certain things where they also believe it's like, oh, that's polluted. You have to do certain things to basically spiritually clean yourself. One of those things is not all Judaic people do this as well as Romani people, but there is the belief that essentially, let's say that a woman has their period, they got to be separated from the group of the people until their period is done. Well, not everyone practices that particular belief anymore, but that was a thing. That's one of the examples of, it's possible to become polluted spiritually and you have to like clean yourself that way. It's like a ancient belief that I don't think really applies in the modern day, but I'm pretty sure there's some places that still practice that. Yeah. And also, Roman people, if we're going to keep adding to this spiritual origin, they still practice Shaktism. So that's another thing that has roots within Hinduism as well, in which the worship of a god is through a female consort. So, in other words, they worship, let's say, for example, with Christianity, they worship the good Lord, the good Savior, Jesus Christ. They will worship Jesus Christ through his mother, Mother Mary. So, the Christian God, for example, they're going to worship it through the Virgin Mary. They need basically a female figure in order to do it. So that is the origins of Hinduism that has kind of never left. Because Hinduism, I'm pretty sure it does things a pretty similar way. Again, it depends on what denomination, but I'm pretty sure the ones that they're in involve female consorts. So there is the heavy belief and practices towards female gods in particular when it came to their version of Hinduism. So there is that. So yeah, female consort. A woman has to be at the forefront. This will probably come back in importance later for Hisoka. I'll talk about how this connects like way later in his adulthood, but we'll come back to this. Yeah, but essentially, women at the forefront. How beautiful. When it comes to beliefs. It's like they'll practice the religion, but a woman's got to be at the forefront. They tend to have the belief, I think, that there's this weird twist of essentially higher expectations, which I mean that tends to be the case for society in general, but I think for them is basically placing women in more so of a spiritual responsibility. I don't know how to describe it, but they tend to show again divinity towards feminine figures a lot more. That's how I can simplify it. And also, this is what I mean by the mixtures of it. So, especially when it comes to his mom or just anybody, when it came to Romani people, they mix it with whatever religion that the majority of the other population is following. So, in the case of our Hispanic Romani friends, they mix a lot of the ancient Hindu beliefs with that of Roman Catholicism, because the majority of Hispanic people slash Latin people are nowadays Roman Catholic. So they tend to use Roman Catholicism, I would say, as a mixture between like a cover slash actually mixing it in with Hinduistic practices. But they basically mix in Roman Catholicism with Hinduistic practices, but they primarily use Roman Catholicism as a cover. Like, if you were to ask what they personally believe, like, let's say you were actually talking to Hisoka nowadays, the answer that he will probably give is one or two, which is like, I don't have a strong inclination towards religion at all. Or two, it's, I still practice essentially Roman Catholicism, but the way that Romani people practice Roman Catholicism is different. Number one, they do not use the church primarily. They tend to practice it a lot more at home. And again, the main reason why is because their version is mixing Roman Catholic beliefs, which the beliefs of like ancient Hindu practices, in order to worship God. And because of that, they tend to basically not attend church as much, but they still do attend church. So we'll talk about how they do when they do. When they do attend church, of course, they are Catholic. So they also participate in the church's sacraments, which is the sacraments of Christian initiation, baptism, Eucharist, confirmation, as the initiation portion. And then they have the sacraments of healing, which is the penance and the reconciliation and anointing of the sick. Then you have the sacraments of service. I know there's a lot of sacraments. And that is matrimony and holy orders. So basically, initiation is probably what you're thinking of. You're thinking of people getting baptized. You're thinking of basically confessing your sins and saying, like, oh, I practice this religion. It's the confirmation of the religion in the first part. Then you have the second part, which is penance and reconciliation and anointing of the sick. So basically, healing of the sick, reconciliation, so healing of the soul and spirit. And you have penance, which I think blends into everything else. I'm not going to go into great detail about penance, but just know that applies. And then you have sacraments of service, which is matrimony, holy orders. So basically putting a high priority towards things like marriage, and holy orders being like any other religious orders that the church may have. I believe this is where essentially the mixtures come in, because for the most part they will do these things, but their church attendance is very mixed. Like, because of the fact, again, that they mix beliefs, what happens is they put a heavy emphasis on baptism, but they practice at home. They will come back for things like weddings, but they practice at home again. It basically means that they attend church for special events when it comes to their religious practice. But a lot of the times, the beliefs are going to be blended in with Hinduism and certain other things of the esoteric kind. So I believe I was watching a couple of documentaries where essentially there were Romani witches, for one, where they still pray to God, they still have crosses and everything, but they also had tarot cards. That's kind of the one way of showing like the mix. And there's also the saint that they have, which is Saint Kali, Sara La Kali. There we go. That's her full name. Santa Sara La Kali, which is another way of essentially showing that they tend to mix it. So she is the Kali goddess that came from Hindu religion and then blended into a saint for Catholicism, specifically for them. So, to explain this fully, as another way of showing that they tend to mix the beliefs, Santa Sara La Kali is the modern rendition of the Hindu goddess Kali and a patron saint to the Romani people. She has provided hope and identity to most of the Roma diaspora. There is a pilgrimage for her every late May, and it's typically to Santes Mares de la Mer, which is a small village in the Camargue region of France, which is funny to me because when I read the name of said nation in France, I was like, this sounds more Spanish than it does sound French, but okay. And yeah, it's a small region in France that they go to basically pay their condolences to this particular, again, feminine figure for their version of Roman Catholicism, which is their version of Christianity. So they basically go to her for protection and healing. And again, this is a perfect blend of both Hindu and Christian practices. So there's a lot of mixtures of that going on. So let's say you go into Hisoka's mom's home. You'll basically see like Jesus figurines, maybe Jesus candles, like things that you typically think of when you think of a religious Hispanic household. But then also you'll see things like tarot cards. You'll probably see other things of the esoteric nature. You'll probably see a altar, things like that, where it's like a whole blend, right? So it's like a mixing of all these different beliefs into one. So how they practice again is they'll go to church for ceremonies such as baptisms, this, that, and forth. It's like dunk the baby in the water, profess him to the Lord, and then you'll go back home and then worship the Lord in however they see fit. Then they'll go again for whatever important ceremony it is for the church. But their church attendance is not on the regular end, again, only because they worship God, I would say, in a different way. But, difference is not bad, it's just different. So that is essentially part one and the whole start of it all. So now that you know the root basics of the matter, you're going to better understand the rest of this analysis. So, part two, we're going to be talking about the teaching practices now that you know, like, the spiritual basics to it all. You're going to be now knowing how this is all taught to Hisoka. So, we're going to get into that in part two. So, stick around for that. But before we get into it again, you want to stick around while having our break. So you can go ahead and have a break, but come back after the intermission.